Hello, my name is Marta Stelmaszak and I'll be presenting a paper I co-wrote with Professor Glenn Parry from University of Surrey Business School. And the topic of our research is data are in the eye of the beholder, co-creating the value of personal data. So in a nutshell, our starting point for this project was the fact that the value of personal data traditionally has been understood mostly in economic terms, but recent scholarship started to look at the concept of the value of data as something that's much more multifaceted, dynamic, emergent, and co-created by stakeholders. But we know little, especially in empirical terms, about the dynamics of this co-creation of value. So in response, we conducted a case study of the development of a personalized ebook. And what we found was that there were different perceptions of value of personal data that existed from three different perspectives: the firm, the intermediary, and the customer. And these different data perspectives really highlighted ontological differences in the perception of what data are. And that created some epistemological tensions and different expectations of the data characteristics that were embedded in the process of value co-creation. So in this presentation, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth into the research we conducted and also discuss our contributions and findings and contributions a little bit more in depth. So first of all, I wanted to start by discussing our literature, our framing in literature, and our main point of interest, which is the value of personal data. So we know that personal data is data pertaining to identifiable individuals and data generated about them or by them. And mostly this data has been researched from the economic perspective that sees this data as a commodity, as asset, good, property, resource, or sometimes referred to as new oil. And mostly in this economic perspective, research focuses on uncovering what's the economic value of this data from the firm's perspective, for example, by looking at company stock value and revenues, tracking the prices of personal data on data marketplaces, and measuring the financial impact of data breaches to try to quantify the economic value of data. From the individual's perspective, most of the research investigates how customers perceive the monetary value of their own personal data. And the common assumption in here is that customers undervalue their data and therefore they have to be educated about its value. And in order to do so, there's a lot of research that attempts to calculate the economic value of data for individuals. But the economic value, if you like, monetary or profit-based value is not the only way in which personal data can be valued. And further, we also know from other strands of literature that data are not a static resource. So the value of it cannot be fixed and defined as concretely and as stably as the economic perspective would like us to believe. Mostly from information systems, we see more and more research that talks about the idea of co-creating value in use. So instead of looking at data as something fixed and static, and try to measure its value, we have this perspective of value in use. That means that the value in objects or offerings is attributed or can be talked about only when individuals are able to use the object, the value of which we try to measure. And that means that we have a variety of stakeholders who are involved in the process of value co-creation, because if this value emerges in use, then it's used by various stakeholders who are involved. And in this view, value is something that's a dynamic, fluid property that changes, and that is in line with how we see the value of data, because data are not static, finished products, but an evolving concern for stakeholders who are involved in the process of co-creating this value. So what we say is that the value of data is not limited to its economic value, but rather is shaped over time through the construction and use of data, and it's contingent on balancing different stakeholders' concerns. So knowing this from literature, we set out on this on answering this main research question that is built on this idea that we have different stakeholders who are involved in the co-creating of the value of data. But what we don't know is how the perceptions of value that are held by stakeholders who are involved in the process of co-creating actually impact, or how they are actually involved in this co-creation of the value of personal data. So we set out to answer this question by conducting a case study of an EPSRC funded project in the UK called Dynamic Real-Time On-Demand Personalization for Scaling, whose main objective was to develop a personalized ebook for children's reading, where children could read together with their parents, and as part of this reading, there would be data generated on top of these reading practices. So this ebook employs various personalization technologies based on this idea of collecting personal data, analyzing them, and providing real-time analytics that all generate value for stakeholders. And the project itself had multiple stakeholders: publishers, small and medium enterprises, designers of personalized digital products, teachers, parents, and children as well. And in order to ensure that the ebook is a source of value for all, the project focused on this multi-stakeholder approach to value creation. And that's what made it a very good fit for our research question. Both myself and Glenn have been involved in this project as researchers. We participated in various design, development, and project meetings, team discussions, and we had good relationships with all 23 stakeholders involved in the project. And that helped us really not only build good rapport, but also get good access to data. So we conducted a number of interviews. We collected documents as well, the summary of which you can see here on the screen. And we analyzed this data by conducting thematic coding. So we started in a bottom-up manner. So we identified lower level codes like building new products or improving products, and then we looked at how these codes could be brought together into bigger themes like value in use or educational value, and so on. So now I wanted to move on and talk a little bit about our findings. And in here you can see some screens from the actual at various stages of the development process of that project. So you can see some mock-ups, but of the actual stories, but you can also see some of the underlying infrastructure. So the whole idea behind the ebook that was being developed as the output of the DROPS project was the fact that it was based on HAT infrastructure, which is a distributed infrastructure that provides personal data servers to store data of parents and children as they read. So we have a configuration that involves an intermediary, the decentralized personal data account. We have the parent and the children, so they're the users of the device who generate data. And then we have the firm, who are ebook publishers, game developers, could be writers, who actually write and provide the books that are operated on through the developed ebook system. So we had these three different excuse me. So we had these three different stakeholders who were involved from the very beginning in the development of the project. So we had the firm, we had the customer, and we had the intermediary. And what very quickly transpired was that the idea of value of the data that was generated about children's reading practices differed a lot depending on whose perspective we were taking. So from the firm's perspective, in here we looked at two firms who are actively participating in the co-creation process. And they were seeing data as valuable because it was an essential component of the product. But also when it was aggregated, it was useful for their business goals, for tuning their strategy and for furthering what they wanted to achieve. And they also emphasized that it was valuable when it was in use. And here we have a very pertinent quote from one of the interviewees who says, "It's not really so much the data, I think, as more using it." From the intermediaries' perspective, here we had interviewees representing three organizations that work together as the intermediary. They saw data that was and its value as a medium of exchange. So something that facilitated the exchange of value between the firm and the customer. And they saw it as a store of value and as a currency that could be used to facilitate this exchange between two groups. Finally, from the customer's perspective, here we observed parents and researchers, and parents were using the net benefit approach to establishing the value of data. So they were weighing the benefits and costs of data in order to ascertain if it's valuable to them. And researchers who could also have access to this data were focusing on the value of data for research and career purposes. So to bring it all together, what we found was that there were three different perspectives on the value of data. The firm mostly saw it as means to an end. Data that was being generated from this ebook was something that would either help them further their strategic goals or was something essential in the product and so on. But it also meant that the kind of characteristics of data that rendered value for them were, for example, granularity, the fact that they were real time, user level, the sheer quantity, and the fact that they could be aggregated. And that was in quite a stark contrast with how customers perceived the value of data. For them, it was mostly net benefit. And here, data characteristics that made it valuable were, for example, the fact that they were ethical or accessible or inconspicuous, or as narrow in scope as possible, generic, portable, relational. And finally, for the intermediary whose perception of value of data was this medium of exchange, data characteristics that rendered value were mobility, portability, veracity, quality, trustworthiness, reliability, and so on. So we can already see that these stand in quite stark contrast to to each other. And then, of course, the way that all of these three stakeholders engage, the kind of practices that they engaged in terms of co-creating value were different as well. And all of this was underpinned by different epistemological assumptions. So to conclude, what we found was that these differing perceptions of value may lead to tensions, for example, in terms of what kind of data should be collected, in what ways, what scope, as part of the product that is being built. And these differences had impact not only on the expectations of value, but they influenced the shape of data that was being created as part of the project. We also found that the value of personal data is not something that's static, defined, or fixed. And that makes product development a challenge because value or the perception of value of data is constantly changing and evolving, and it's an outcome of negotiations between these different stakeholders. Of course, that was research that we conducted in one quite specific product. So we definitely think that more research is needed in other personalized products. But at the same time, we would like to highlight that policy and governance really needs to focus on ensuring that these different divergent needs of stakeholders that converge in data are met as part of the development process and later on in products. And finally, managers need to make sure that the personalized offerings that are being developed align the value propositions of all stakeholders, how they perceive value, in order to build offerings that are actually perceived as valuable by stakeholders. So that was to give you an overview of the research that we conducted, and we're really looking forward to hearing your comments and feedback on how we can develop this idea further.